Rick Coste, thanks so much for coming on to Evolution Soup all the way from New Hampshire, USA. You are an author, writer, audio producer, and novelist. Your book, Evolution Talk, will be published by Prometheus Books in October of this year, based, of course, on your highly popular podcast of the same name. As well as diving into the world of your podcast and all the fascinating topics you cover on the show, we'll also focus on one of its most popular episodes, The Piltdown Man, a tale from the early days of paleoanthropology that captivated the entire world until it was exposed by science as a hoax. So how are you doing, Rick? I know you spend a lot of time recording and editing, but you also like to go for a run and get lots of exercise. Have you been able to do that today, or has it been nose to the grindstone?
Well, first, Mark, thanks for having me here. I was excited about talking to you. So yeah, I get up at 4 a.m. every morning, and that's the only way I get things done. I do have a full-time job, which roughly goes, 9 to 5, depending on the day and what's going on. But so, that being said, I get up at 4 in the morning. Gives me good 3 hours to just create, whether it be writing, video editing, podcasting. I'm not as good at the video editing as you are, but I'm trying. So yeah, so I also podcast, have quite a few shows that I've worked on in the past, audio dramas, the Evolution Talk show. I've had other shows as well, which we'll probably touch upon. But yeah, and after the creative time, I spend some time, we have a beautiful park that's not too far away. It's about 4 miles down the road. It's about 30 acres of extended paths. There's a footbridge, goes over a river. So I usually go for a run and a walk before the full-time job hits.
Well, before we make a start, let's just hear about where you began. You grew up in Massachusetts, same as myself, in a town not too far from my hometown of Braintree. Isn't that right?
Yeah, I grew up in Hanson, Massachusetts, which is right next to Brockton, and I believe it's 13 miles from Braintree. My father was a shoe designer. He also, he designed shoes, and also was later in life was a VP in research and development for a sneaker company. So in Massachusetts, the small little town that I lived in, Hanson, was right on, I don't know if you've ever heard of the Bridgewater Triangle, but it's said to be like a paranormal triangle located in Massachusetts, whether you believe that or not. So my head was filled with stories of Bigfoot, UFOs, things like that. Back in the 70s, there was a show called In Search Of, starring Leonard Nimoy. So that was that caught my attention as well. At a very impressionable young age, someone who was interested in that type of stuff. And we had a lot of woods behind our house, which we'd explore and think we're looking for Bigfoot and all of those things. So my other big love at the time was comic books, Marvel Comics being one. I was a big reader, probably from the age of, as soon as I could read, age of 5, 6 years old, I was reading comics. So I'd sit there with a stack of comics and a dictionary. Any word I didn't understand, I'd pull out the dictionary and find out what it was that the characters were trying to say. So it was around this time that my mother handed me a typewriter, one of those old style typewriters that have the ribbon and everything. So I'm banging away on the keys, trying to write my own stories. And a lot of these stories were, they were silly, but I was trying to continue what I had been reading in the comics. So I put the comic down and I try to continue that and type out the stories. So I've always had a love for storytelling. Another thing that I was very interested in at an early age was old radio shows. Most of those old radio shows were from like the 30s and the 40s, way before my time. But there was quite a lot of records, vinyl records you could get of these old radio shows like The Shadow or Inner Sanctum. Again, it was all the type of things that I was interested in at the time, the ghost stories and superhero stories and such. So I would listen to those. So flash forward a few years, we had moved to New Hampshire, which is where I live now. I'm in New Hampshire. And podcasting came out. So this would have been, I think around 2005, 2006, that podcasting, hit the scene. It was a few years after that, started really diving into podcasts, loving podcasts. Of course, I kind of at that point I was heavily into science at the time as well, Richard Dawkins and so forth. So I was reading a lot of books about evolution, evolution by natural selection, about archaeology, paleontology, and all of that. So I would gravitate to those type of podcasts, anything that was science-based, as well as the paranormal type of shows, which I always had an interest in. Around 2012, I thought, yeah, I can do this. I'm a writer, and I know my way around audio equipment, not so much video, but the audio equipment. I'm kind of a hack when it comes to playing guitar and stuff, so I know about microphones and recording. So I started my own podcast. The very first one was called Philosophy Walk. It was, as it sounds, all about philosophy. So that was kind of how I cut my teeth. I learned how to edit, learned how to record narrating. These are all scripted shows. They weren't free form, but I also, like, some of my favorite shows at the time were shows like Radiolab or some of the NPR shows, This American Life and such. Radiolab especially, because they had a lot of, they transitioned from story to story, and they'd also have a lot of music. So there was a lot of music in the background. So I would try to emulate that. And it was good for me to have a show like that to model my shows after, because of the production values of that show. So it helped me with that philosophy show. It helped me kind of grow as a podcaster. After Philosophy Walk, I thought, I think I might have done 60 shows or 60 episodes, of Philosophy Walk, and thought, you know what, I'm going to try my hand at, evolution. I'll create a science-based education show based on evolution, and see if I can, in a sense, give back everything that I had learned over the past 2 decades about evolution. So that started in 2014, and it immediately began to do very well, which I was excited about. Plus, I had all that the past 2 years of background doing production for Philosophy Walk. So Evolution Talk was kind of a step above that as far as production values go. Around episode 31 of Evolution Talk, I did an episode where I interviewed Charles Darwin. I thought it would be a fun episode to do. I hired a voice actor to do the voice of Charles Darwin. And in a sense, it was kind of recapturing those old radio shows that I used to love listening to. So I was able to, add effects, add, background noise, music. So it sounded like I had gone back in time, sitting across from Charles Darwin and interviewing him. I had so much fun doing that show that I thought, you know what? I bet you I can start doing some audio drama or audio fiction shows. At the time, there weren't a lot of those. There were some, so it wasn't like I was the first one to come up with, hey, let's do audio drama on podcasts. We had Welcome to Night Vale was out, and some Bright Sessions and some other shows. So I started doing audio drama. Still did the Evolution Talk show, but then I picked up writing scripts for audio drama, did my own casting and directing, and put the whole thing together. I did about 11 audio drama shows at that time, from like 2016 to 2019, 2020. Still keeping Evolution Talk alive, still doing that. And then around that time too, I started doing post-production for Marvel on their podcasts, which was exciting for me because I had loved Marvel comics since I was a kid. So I'd love to have gone back to, my 5-year-old, 6-year-old self, said, hey, look what you're doing now. You're working with Marvel. Didn't work for Marvel, but I was working with them and doing their post-production. So I did that for a couple of their flagship shows. And then, that ended when Marvel pulled all of their podcasting efforts in-house and in New York, which I wasn't going to move to New York to continue doing that. So here we are today, and still doing the Evolution Talk podcast, dabbling with editing other folks' shows. There's a couple friends of mine who have shows of their own, and they hired me to do the editing for them as well.
In 2013, a South African cave system was found to be hiding a secret. Now, this secret had been hidden there for hundreds of thousands of years, and it was discovered 2 years ago. It's events such as these that make me happy to be alive today.
Your podcast, Evolution Talk, has been going strong since 2014. Each week you present short, slickly produced presentations on all aspects of evolution, everything from mitochondrial Eve to the evolution of music. Rick, what is the process for producing these episodes, and which ones have been the most popular?
So the process, well, it's an involved process. I start with, I'll have a list of shows I would like to cover over the next, few months, so that I'm not, lacking for ideas. And then it's research. So because it's a weekly podcast, although in all honesty, the last year I've only produced a handful of them because of another reason, which we'll get to. But anyway, so I'll have the idea for the show for the particular episode. I'll research that. I'll have my notes, and then I script it. It's a lot like writing a chapter of, say, a book. So I'll script that out, and then it comes time to record, which is fun for me. I've always enjoyed doing the recording aspect of it. In my small little studio. Once it's recorded, then it's editing, and I have software for doing that, which can improve the sound of my voice and cut out any background noise. I live on it's not a busy road, but every once in a while a motorcycle will go by, so I have to cut that out.
Oh yeah.
So there's a lot of fun with that when somebody starts up their lawnmower across the street or something. So after that's done, then it's adding the music. I do a lot of background music, not overwhelming, but just enough to add a little bit of flavor depending on what the subject is. So I'll change up the music on per section of the particular episode, along with some sound effects. Again, I try not to overdo that. I hate listening to shows which have sound effects that are in your face, like it can get a little ridiculous. So I try to keep it subtle, but just also to add some flavor and to add a little bit of dynamics to what you're listening to, and also to kind of create a theater of the mind as the listener is engaging with the show. And I do that with all of the episodes. I'll include a little bit of that music and effects. I would say for my shows are fairly short too. I think the longest show I did was 15 minutes long, or longest episode was 15 minutes long. So I would say for each 15-minute episode, it might take 3 hours of post-production to get that ready. Probably a little bit quicker because I've been doing it a long time, so I'm fairly quick at it and know what I want to do. Even before I start recording, I make little notes of what kind of effects I'd like to add. And I have a huge effects library and music library that's podcast safe that I'll add to the show. So that's what goes into creating it. I mentioned that for the last year, I've only done maybe, a handful of episodes of Evolution Talk. And the reason for that is there is now a book, an Evolution Talk book, which will be coming out, and it is adapted from the podcast. It's based on the podcast. It has a lot of new material that's not in the podcast. So I've been very busy with that, with the book, and getting that prepared with the publisher, working with the publisher to get that ready. Some of the more popular episodes, the Darwin episodes are very popular. They're the early ones, and that's how I kind of started the podcast. I started with the history of evolution, or evolution by natural selection, and then brought it into some of the science behind it and some of the science today, and what science today has to say about evolution by natural selection, some of the developments since Darwin. Mary Anning is a very popular episode. That was one of the later ones that was done, I would say, maybe a couple of years ago. And I think you might have mentioned the evolution of music. That's a very, very popular one as well. It gets a lot of downloads. And there seem to be some of the more popular ones are the more recent ones, oddly enough, too. And that might have a lot to do with the audience growing over time.
One of your most popular episodes, and certainly my favorite, was an episode that came out in 2015, the Piltdown Man. Now, this is a subject I've wanted to cover on this channel for quite a while now. So for anyone who doesn't know, what was the story of the Piltdown Man?
So it's quite a story, actually. Oh, yeah. So you have to I'll give you an overview of the story, and to get the story from its very beginning, we have to go back to the late 19th century. At that time, Europe was having a hard time when it came to fossils of hominids. In 1885, I had to think for a second if it was 1885. That was when the first Neanderthal man specimens were discovered, and that was in the Neander Valley. And in 1909, half a century later, skulls were found in France, and they also belonged to the Neanderthal. France was also home to the Cro-Magnons, another early form of modern humans. Europe at that time had been a hotbed of activity. When I say at the time, I mean when the hominids walked the earth, when before they'd gone extinct. It had been a hotbed of activity 100,000 years ago. You had Homo sapiens emerging as the dominant race around, or dominant species, I should say, around 25 to 40,000 years ago, when the last Neanderthals faded from view. Fossils were found everywhere, but in England. That was the thing. They were not popping up in England. So England was really kind of the odd man out when it came to fossils of early man. The English had to sit back and watch as skulls were unearthed in Germany, in the Neanderthal Valley, which I mentioned, France and Italy. So in the 19th century, along comes a fossil collector and amateur paleontologist by the name of Charles Dawson. So Dawson says that he was walking along close to Piltdown Commons and came across a skull and bones. So he had in his possession part of the skull that he said he had found at Piltdown Common, as well as a jawbone. And this was in 1912. So everyone, of course, is excited. So he shows his find to a young Jesuit priest and paleontologist named Teilhard de Chardin. So working with de Chardin, and also the then keeper of the British Museum's Natural History, his name was Arthur Smith Woodward. I had to think for a second to make sure I got the name right. So Dawson prepared to announce his find to the Geological Society of London. Of course, everyone's excited that they found something in England that relates to perhaps Neanderthals, perhaps something else they didn't know. So according to Woodward, when he looked at the skull, he found, or he said, that it was very close to being that of a modern human, but that there were differences, that it wasn't a modern human because the brain size was smaller by about a third. And the jawbone itself was not much different than that of, say, a chimpanzee. Now, along the way, everybody's listening to this, everybody's excited, everybody wants to know, what is this that Dawson had found? And of course, you have Woodward also saying that this is a major find, and that the teeth were even different. Two of the molars were distinctly human-like, but Woodward also summed it up, or I shouldn't say summed it up, he stunned everybody by saying that Dawson may have found the missing link. Is something everybody was looking for. You'd always hear the term the missing link, the link between man and ape. And Dawson apparently found it in the Piltdown Man.
Yeah, that was a big thing at the time, wasn't it?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, it was huge. So the find was, they gave it a name, and of course they named it after Dawson. It was, I'm going to get this name wrong, and I always say it wrong, but I want to say it's Anthropus Dawsoni, or something like that. Anthropus, but it does mean Dawson's Dawn Man. So the rest of the world knew it as the Piltdown Man. Also, not too long after that, in 1938, it was such a big deal that Sir Arthur Keith, who was president of the Anthropological Society, or Anthropological Institute, commemorated a memorial to Charles Dawson for this find, and that was in 1938. So that was, we're talking what, 20, my math is really bad. So 28 years later, the Piltdown Man was still a big deal, and they had a memorial commemoration for that, along with the plaque.
So this apparent hominid skull is discovered here in England in 1912 and presented to the scientific community. Its finder, Dawson, becomes quite the celebrity worldwide. But this certainly isn't the end of the story, is it?
Not at all. So that was in 1912 when Dawson announced that, hey, look what I found at Piltdown Common. So in 1915, 3 years later, he did it again. He presented another piece, or another skull, a second skull. This time it was from a spot that wasn't more than a couple miles away from where the original Piltdown Man bones had originally been discovered by Dawson. And along with the skull, it wasn't just the skull. So along with the skull, he also said he found what appeared to be an elephant tusk that had been shaped into some sort of tool. At the time, it was jokingly referred to as being the Piltdown Man's cricket bat. And there are some illustrations at the time which show the Piltdown Man holding a cricket bat. So Dawson and Woodward looked at the skull and placed the age of the skull at 500,000 years, 500,000 years old. So this would, if that were true, it would identify the Piltdown Man as being the oldest human relative discovered ever. Unfortunately for Dawson, his celebration was short-lived, at least his personal celebration of everything and the fame that came with it. He died a year later of septicemia. And I mentioned already 15 years after that, is in 1938 is when Sir Arthur Keith, presented the Piltdown Man Memorial to mark the location of that original discovery, which was near Sussex, I believe, where Piltdown Common is. Now, something very strange happened shortly thereafter. A German anthropologist named Franz Weidenreich, and if there's any relatives of Weidenreich and I butchered that name, I apologize. But Weidenreich was a professor at the University of Heidelberg, and this might have been around 1923. But according to Weidenreich, something was terribly wrong with the skull. Namely, that's the original one, namely the skull and the mandible. He said they were of two different species, not a mix of two species as Dawson had claimed, but two separate individuals altogether. The skull, according to Weidenreich, belonged to a modern human being, and the jaw belonged to an orangutan. And those peculiar teeth that had been mentioned, that he said that they had been filed down. This was in 1923. Nobody listened to him. And if they did, it didn't stop the Piltdown Man from becoming a major find, because as I said, in 1938, 15 years later, is when that memorial was placed in Sussex. Now, and flash forward again to 1949, a team of scientists that consisted of Kenneth Oakley, Joseph Biner, and Sir Wilfred Edward LeGros Clark took another look at the Piltdown Man, at the skulls. They performed fluorine tests on them. And what a fluorine test allowed them to do was to measure the amounts of fluorine in the bones, especially bones that had been buried in the ground. Over time, fluorine content will increase. And by measuring that, you can determine if the bones that are found in the same area are roughly of the same age. This wasn't the case with the skull and the jaw of the Piltdown Man, just as Weidenreich had said all those years before, and no one had listened to him. They were different times, or they were of different times, and they were of different animals. Not just two animals, but three. So this was in 1949. Then in 1953, on November 21st, 1953 to be exact, the New York Times declared, the headline might have been something like, Piltdown Man hoax is exposed. I don't know if Weidenreich was still alive at that time, but and being 30 years later, but I'm sure he was smiling, or probably wondering why no one had listened to him. He was probably said, yeah, I knew that all along. But the bones had been treated, in the article, they revealed that the bones had been treated with an iron and chromic acid solution to give those bones and the skull and the mandible the appearance of age. The jaw, in fact, was an orangutan, as Weidenreich had said, and the teeth, they were chimpanzee teeth, which had been filed down. And if you take a microscope and look at those teeth, you can even see where the file marks are. So the age of the jaw, of course, this wasn't 500,000 years old as had been the claim. The age of the jaw was placed at around 500 years, not quite 500,000 years. Nope. And the jig was up, basically. The jawbone was 500 years old, as the skull was eventually carbon dated to be a little bit older, but not by much, maybe around 700 years max.
Well, the story Piltdown Man didn't end in 1953. Recently, in 2016, the story blazed across the news again as new conclusions were made about this hoax. So tell us about that.
Yeah, so one of the things since 1953, since it was all revealed to be a hoax, of course, everyone was deflated, but it was a hoax. The question was, it was just like an old murder mystery. Who did it? Who perpetuated the hoax? Who put all of this together? There was a number of suspects, and Dawson being one of them. Another very interesting suspect at the time was none other than Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. He's the creator of Sherlock Holmes. Apparently, Doyle played a lot of golf at Piltdown and when he was on vacation, and he was also an amateur collector of bones and had a big interest in fossils. So his name was floated as a suspect, not really justified, but again, it was an interesting piece of history that his name came up as being a suspect. So yeah, we're talking about now, and what we know now, and you can never know for sure, but what it looks like, and it's fairly certain we know who it is, that it was Dawson himself. The reason being that reddish brown stain that was applied to make the bones look old, it was the same on all of the specimens. The specimens themselves had local gravel packed into the crevices, and that gravel was packed in using dentist putty to also fix the teeth and keep the gravel in place. So a strategy like that to fool the scientific establishment would usually point to one person, especially when you're talking everything was done the same. It wasn't like they were different finds, kind of done up different ways. Everything was done the same. And also, the thing that which Dawson made a mistake with is he found them in two separate locations. So you have Piltdown 1, that's where the original jawbone and skull fragments were planted and excavated in 1912. And then you have Piltdown 2, which was a short distance away, and Dawson claimed to find another matching tooth and skull pieces in 1915 along with that tusk. So he's the only person who ever said that there was another site. You had Piltdown 1 and Piltdown 2. He's the only one who ever associated with those sites, both of them. So those molars are clearly linked to the original specimens. The exact shape of the molars from the two sites, as well as DNA, which they didn't have back then, but obviously, we can do that now. Traces of DNA found in the teeth at both the Piltdown 1 and the Piltdown 2 sites suggest they all came from a jawbone of a single orangutan, one orangutan. Probably, I think they said a subspecies of orangutan from the Borneo. But planting that third tooth at Piltdown 2 was Dawson's downfall.
And I always wonder about his name. Charles Dawson sounds suspiciously like Charles Darwin. I mean, do you think he changed his name just to sound more authentic, or is that crazy?
At this point, I wouldn't put anything past him. It's too bad. Too bad he's not around today, because it would be. I'd love to ask him about it.
Well, why do you think he did it, though, Rick? I mean, is it fame, money, both? Well, why do you think?
I think it's all the above. As I mentioned, earlier, England did not have a specimen of their own. I mentioned, the Neanderthal, Germany, France, and all of that. I think that he did want the notoriety. It might have been a little bit of national pride. I don't know.
Yes.
But I would put it all to that. I don't think he was doing anything evil, but I think it might have gotten a little bit out of control when he might have been surprised too at the reaction, and probably found it necessary to come up with a Piltdown 2 to say, hey, there are more of these, and he probably got just as caught up in it as anyone else would, probably more so than he expected.
And plus, the fame from Piltdown 1 was probably fading at that point as well.
That's a good point. Yes, you're right. It was 3 years later, so I wouldn't be surprised.
Well, what we've been able to show, I think pretty convincingly, is that the same pieces of ape jaw were used in two separate Piltdown sites. And what we've shown is that the tooth from the second Piltdown site, this tooth here, with a very high degree of certainty, came from the same jawbone that was found at Piltdown 1. Charles Dawson, who obviously is a main candidate as the hoaxer, he must have had the whole jaw in his possession. He modified it and planted it at Piltdown 1, and then he kept back part of it and modified and planted this molar at the Piltdown 2 site. Well, I think because Charles Dawson is the only person identified with that second Piltdown find, I think it shows that he was centrally involved in the whole business. In our view, he was certainly capable of doing all of the modification, and we also think we can demonstrate in the analyses we've done that the hoaxer, or hoaxers, but let's say Dawson, they actually kind of learnt as they went along.
Well, there are those today who think that this was a deliberate hoax by the scientific community, but it was actually the scientific community that exposed it as a hoax. Isn't that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's really silly, short-sighted to blame the scientific community. If anyone who doesn't understand how it works, how science works. This was all done by one man with an agenda. Science is all about the evidence. As we progress, and this is a really good example of that, the exposing of the Piltdown Man hoax. As we progress, we come up with new tools and new technologies, new techniques to test bones, to test remains, to extract DNA. And a lot of times, as science progresses, we'll go back to retest what we thought we knew. The Neanderthals are a good example of this, as is the Piltdown Man bones. Bones have been retested especially with Neanderthal bones, they've been retested a number of times as these processes improve. So science is self-correcting. We're constantly trying to figure out ages and understand the tree of life as it relates, or where we fit into. When I say we, I mean the Homo sapiens fit into the tree of life. And that's looking at Neanderthals, looking at where they came from, what happened to them, how they, what caused them to go extinct. Same thing with the Piltdown Man. Those bones were tested once by Weidenreich way before DNA. Again, it was tested by the scientific team in 1949. And again, in this century, using DNA to place with the eye. So the scientific community is the one that solved the mystery, and also helped kind of direct everybody's gaze towards Dawson himself as being the perpetrator.
Yeah, and on the plus side, the whole thing generated interest in the subject of evolution and paleoanthropology. Isn't that right?
Absolutely, and that's my favorite piece of it. It's funny too. Going back, when we were talking about this, going back to 2016 to look at that New York, the article that had come out, I looked at the downloads, the histories. The Piltdown Man, at that time, the Piltdown Man had already come out, that particular episode, I believe.
Yeah. Shortly
after that, the download numbers increased for the show as a whole. So it didn't hurt my show either. having people reading about evolution by natural selection and also wondering what it's about. It does bring eyes to the subject.
Well, many of the stories covered in the Evolution Talk podcast are now part of the new Evolution Talk book, out soon by Prometheus Books. So what was the process for you compiling this book, and what can people expect when they dive into its pages?
Yeah, so the book itself, it's coming out in October 2022. It's appropriately titled Evolution Talk after the podcast, and it is adapted from the podcast. It's not an exact duplicate of the podcast, but a lot of the episodes that are in the podcast itself have made their way into the book, and of course, reworked, because you're going from audio to written form, and I want to keep it interesting. I want to add new content and such. The Piltdown Man is not in the book. Not everything from the podcast would make it into the book, and of course there are things in the book that aren't in the podcast. So as far as the process for compiling the book and what people can expect, the process, as with all of my projects, it was a fun one. I mean, I enjoy the subject, so it wasn't a hard process to take the content, rework it, reorganize it, add to it. A lot of editing, because when I do the episodes for Evolution Talk, they're scripted and I write them out, but I don't care about proper grammar in the writing of the script, because I will ad-lib as I go along. So a lot of times it's an outline of things that I need to do or want to say in the show. So taking those scripts, turning it into chapters in a book, it was an effort, but like I said, it was a good one, and I did that for a few months. Wrote a proposal, created a proposal for it, sent it to an agent. The agent loved it, signed with the agent, and they began the work to find a publisher, and Prometheus Books stepped in to champion the book. So Prometheus Books will be is publishing it. It'll, like I said, being released in October, and I believe the UK, sorry Mark, but the UK version won't be available until December. Don't hold me to that, but I'm pretty sure that's what I heard. It'll be 2 months after the US release, and it'll be available any place that you buy books, online, in stores and such. There's also an audio version of the book, and Prometheus asked me to actually do that, which was cool too. Because I podcast, but I've never narrated a book. So that was another thing I had never done before. It was actually.
How long did that take?
Yeah, it was actually, it's funny. It was actually harder than writing the book to actually do the audiobook.
Yes, I've done a little bit of it and I gave up actually.
Yeah, you're very self-conscious. At least I was very self-conscious about it. Wanted to get it right. Wanted to being from New England and New Hampshire, I'm sure it's come across today. I kind of dropped the R's when I talk. So I tried not to do that so much with the audiobook. But the publisher said, they wanted it to be, be yourself, do it just like you would a podcast. And, I tried to keep the feel of the podcast, but also I wanted to appeal to folks who are used to audiobooks. I've listened to a few audiobooks in the past myself. So I just went back and listened to some of my favorites to get the feel for it. So it took a long time. I would say each chapter might have taken 15 minutes to read, to read out loud. But then actually, I would take that back. It's probably more like 20, 25 minutes to read out loud. But then going back and editing all of that, making sure that it fits some, there's audiobooks that are kind of stringent for levels and such. So I had to make sure that it all was compliant with what you need to do for an audiobook. So it was quite the process for me. Would I do it again? Probably. If it was, for my next book, if they asked, I would probably do it again. If it was somebody else's book, I think I'd be a little bit more leery of accepting it.
And what do you hope people will get out of the book?
Yeah, so my desire is to teach, and that was my desire with the podcast itself, was to talk about the history of evolution by natural selection pre-Darwin, including Darwin, and after Darwin. So the first section of the book is all about those pre-Darwinian thinkers, including Erasmus Darwin, Charles Darwin's own grandfather, who had this very same ideas, but without the law of evolution by natural selection. Without bringing natural selection into it, he was already talking about evolution, as were so many people before him, so many thinkers before him. Also, then you have Darwin, and Darwin had his doubts that he struggled with his theory of evolution by natural selection. It might have been his theory, but he did struggle with it for a number of reasons. One of them being his relationship with God, which he really didn't have one at the time, but his wife did. And he struggled with that. And also in the book, I do touch upon some of the later developments with the theory and some of the things that we do know after Darwin, that we've discovered after Darwin, like DNA. It wasn't around, or they didn't know about it in Darwin's time. They didn't even know about genes in Darwin's time. Darwin called them something else instead of genes, because genes was not a word. So yeah, that's my whole point of putting the book out there, is to, like I said earlier, to really give back. I mean, I learned a lot over the past couple of decades just devouring books about evolution by natural selection. Wanted to do something with it, so started the podcast, and now comes the book.
Well, you're producing new content for the Evolution Talk audio podcast every week, and the book will be out soon. So what about future episodes of the podcast and future projects in general? What can you let us in on?
Well, the show must go on. So the Evolution Talk podcast is continuing. There was a slight hiatus, I will say. When I was heavily into audio drama, there was I would say 2 years where the Evolution Talk podcast was put on hiatus while I focused on those other projects. Now that I'm back into it, now that the book's coming out, I am producing new episodes. So there will be new episodes to come in later 2022, especially in 2023. And I'm also planning a follow-up book, which will not be part of the podcast. The subject is still similar, but it won't be taken from any of the subject material or subject matters that I cover in the podcast itself. So the podcast will be a separate effort, and while I continue to work on the follow-up to Evolution Talk.
I will leave links to your social media, podcast, and of course, the Evolution Talk book in the description below. And hopefully we can have you back on the show in the very near future.
Thank you, Mark. I really enjoyed this. I really enjoyed the show, and I love the fact that we had this time to talk.